All right, so you're here with us on the deep dive because you're really looking to understand these complex issues, right? You want to get to the heart of the matter, and you don't have a ton of time to wade through all the noise.
That's exactly right. And what we really see shining through in the materials you've given us is this idea of liberty. And it's not just like, oh, liberty is nice. It's presented as like the core, the foundation of everything else that's good.
Yeah, freedom leads to good things,
Hmm.
but the sources we're looking at go deeper. Like they're saying these benefits, these great things about society, they don't come from the government.
They can't. It's more like when you have individual freedom, the good stuff is a natural outcome, like innovation and creativity, progress. These things just blossom.
And it's pretty amazing to see this idea, this concept of individual liberty and the role of government playing out across so many different areas.
Seriously. We're going from something as personal as abortion to, the global scale of the war on terror, and then even diving into things like monetary policy, even Zionism. It's a lot. But that's why we're here. In this deep dive, we're zeroing in on the big takeaways about liberty as it relates to all these really critical issues, always sticking to what your sources are actually saying.
Exactly. No personal opinions, just understanding the arguments, making those connections, and giving you that clear view of it all.
Okay, so let's jump right in with something that always sparks a lot of debate. Abortion. One thing that really struck me in the material was this story from an OBGYN resident back in the 60s.
Oh, I remember that one.
Yeah. It was before abortion was legal everywhere. And this doctor saw an abortion where they took out this fetus and it seemed to be viable. It's like 2 pounds and it was crying, gasping for air.
Such a powerful image. And the way it's presented, you really feel the moral struggle it caused for the person who saw it. They were forced to grapple with the whole issue on a whole other level. And when you think about it, within that whole framework of individual liberty, the core issue seems to be about a woman's right to choose, her right to make her own decisions about her body and her reproductive choices.
Absolutely. It all comes down to personal autonomy, right?
Now, taking a big step back to a much bigger picture, we have the whole idea of the war on terror. And right away, the material challenges that term. It's calling it, kind of a cliche, like the war on drugs or even the war on poverty.
Yeah. It makes you wonder, why use that language? What's the problem with framing terrorism as a war?
And the sources are pretty clear about that. The big concern is that by calling it a war, it kind of opens the door for this expansion of government power. And often it seems at the cost of individual liberty.
Because if we're at war, well, then all bets are off. We have to do whatever it takes, right? That's the kind of logic that takes over.
And the material gets really specific about what those whatever it takes measures might be. Secret arrests, secret prisons, even torture. There's also the whole thing with secret rendition.
Rendition, that's where they take people to other countries, with less strict human rights laws.
Right. And what I found interesting is that the material points out these things were happening under both Bush and Obama. So it's not just a one-party issue.
Exactly. And that ties right back to your desire to understand the potential threats to your freedoms, because the argument is that this war on terror idea has been used to justify things that in peacetime would be clear violations of your rights.
Okay, so let's switch gears for a minute and talk about the economy, specifically the business cycle. The way the sources look at this is, kind of unexpected. They're not saying that recessions are the big economic disaster. Instead, they're focusing on the boom that comes before it.
Right. It's like they're saying, don't just look at the crash, look at what led up to it.
Yeah. So why the focus on the boom times? Well, they're arguing that recessions are basically just a correction, like after a boom that wasn't really built on solid ground.
Like a market correction.
Yeah, exactly. Or like your body recovering after you push it too hard.
I like that analogy. So basically, they're saying recessions are a kind of healing process necessary after a period of, economic imbalance.
So to really understand why a recession happens, you got to look at what went wrong during the good times. The things that led to this unsustainable boom, it's about those root causes.
It makes you think about, are we paying attention to the right things? Are we looking deep enough?
Definitely. Now let's move to another area that always gets people fired up.
Yeah.
Campaign finance. The author has some pretty strong opinions about limits on campaign donations. They even call the federal limit, I think it's around $2,400, senseless.
Yeah, I mean, what's the logic there? Why that specific number?
Exactly. And the argument is, if someone truly believes in a candidate and wants to support them, Why shouldn't they be able to give as much as they want?
It's
Their money, right?
it's about voluntary support. They're not being forced to donate.
Right. And the material acknowledges that the amount of money in politics can seem crazy. It even uses the word obscene, but it's saying that the real issue is something bigger.
They're saying the real obscenity is the size and scope of government itself. Because when the government controls so much of our lives, through regulations and taxes and all that, people are going to fight tooth and nail to influence who's in power.
So the money is a symptom of the problem, not the problem itself.
Exactly. The money follows the power.
Now, another interesting case the material covers is Julian Assange. There's a very strong defense of what he did.
Yeah. Their main point is that through WikiLeaks, Assange was just releasing information that was true.
And they make a point of saying that while it may have embarrassed governments, it didn't actually hurt anyone directly. So the question they ask is, how can someone be punished for revealing the truth?
Especially when you consider that governments themselves are often secretive. They have their own skeletons in the closet.
Right. And that's where the whole hypocrisy thing comes in. The material asks, what if the people in Washington who are manipulating the currency or imposing unconstitutional taxes were held to the same standard as Assange?
It's a thought-provoking question, that's for sure.
And their preferred solution is to deal with the things that allow governments to do those shady things in the first place, not punish people like Assange for bringing them to light.
Transparency, accountability. Those are the real solutions, they argue.
Okay, so moving on to the CIA. It's painted as this incredibly powerful and mysterious organization operating all over the world.
And the material highlights a really big concern about a lack of oversight, not just from Congress, but even from presidents.
So who's watching the watchers?
Right. And part of the reason for that lack of accountability, they suggest, is because the CIA is somehow able to finance itself.
And it doesn't stop there. They talk about the CIA waging undeclared wars, carrying out drone bombings, trying to rig elections in other countries, even assassinations.
And then there's the whole use of private contractors, which makes it even harder to track what they're doing.
The material even suggests that the CIA might be involved in illegal activities to fund itself, like drug trafficking.
That would be a huge deal, bypassing Congress and the budget process.
It's scary to think about. And the sources link this directly back to liberty, saying that this kind of power, operating in the shadows, is a huge threat to both individual freedom and national security. They even suggest that maybe the CIA has a reason to make other countries seem more dangerous than they are.
So they can justify their own existence and their budget.
It's a really disturbing thought. And they make a strong case for a much closer look at how intelligence agencies are controlled in a society that values freedom and transparency.
I think a lot of people would agree with that.
Okay, let's shift gears again to protest and civil disobedience. The material takes a specific stance on how those actions are seen by people in power.
It basically says that any protest, even those protected by the Constitution, are seen as a challenge to the government.
A direct challenge to their power and authority. And honestly, they kind of have a point.
Right. I mean, that's what protest is. It's saying we don't agree, we're not going to be silent.
Exactly. But the material does acknowledge that a lot of good has come from protests, and they really respect the people who've put themselves on the line, risked arrest to fight for what they believe in.
Definitely. And while the author seems to prefer more, traditional ways of making change, like voting and education, there's this clear admiration for people who engage in civil disobedience, especially when it's nonviolent.
Because it's not easy. And it can be risky. But they see it as a powerful tool.
A way to wake people up, to educate them about injustice.
Yeah.
And it can be much faster than working through the courts.
But they're not saying to give up on the legal system altogether.
It's more like, don't put all your eggs in one basket. Sometimes you need to take direct action to create real change.
Now, moving on to something more extreme, the idea of overthrowing the government by force. The author is pretty clear that they don't know of any big organized groups calling for that.
And they really emphasize that most people in America just find that idea horrifying. It's just not acceptable to most.
Instead, most people believe in working within the system, however frustrating it can be. And they talk about changing people's minds through education, through understanding, and even through peaceful civil disobedience like we were talking about.
Like the civil rights movement. They accomplish so much without resorting to violence.
Now, the draft, and specifically the requirement to register for the draft, gets a lot of attention in the material. They see it as this symbol of the government's power over individuals.
It's like that saying, the power to tax is the power to destroy. Well, the draft is like saying, We own you. We can take you and make you fight whenever we want.
It's basically saying we can kidnap you at any time. And they say that that should never be acceptable in a free society.
And they argue that a volunteer army is perfectly capable of defending the country, especially if we have a foreign policy that's less focused on getting involved in everyone else's business.
They make a good point that military historians haven't found any evidence that a draft army is better than a volunteer one. And they also talk about how unfair the draft can be with all the exemptions and deferments for certain people.
It's like some people get a free pass while others are forced to go.
They even use examples like the Civil War, where rich people could pay for substitutes to go in their place. And then there's those, what do they call them, chicken hawks?
The people who dodged the draft but then later pushed for war.
Right. They argue that all of this shows that the draft is just not a fair system. And they make a strong case for getting rid of draft registration completely.
As a step towards, real individual liberty.
Now, the concept of private property, they see it as the foundation of a free society. And they argue that all forms of private property should have the same level of protection under the law.
They make this analogy between, say, a newspaper office or a church, which are generally seen as having strong protection from the government.
And they say, if those places are protected, why shouldn't a regular business be given the same level of protection?
It's about consistency. Right.
And they go so far as to defend even things like burning the American flag on your own property.
As long as it's your property and you're not endangering anyone else.
Yeah. And they get really frustrated with some of the tactics used by politicians, especially Republicans, who try to exploit that issue for votes.
It's like they're using patriotism as a weapon.
And they emphasize the importance of the home as a place where individuals should be able to make their own choices.
You should be free to choose who you live with, who you invite over, and even how you behave within your own home.
Without the government interfering.
Yeah.
And they criticize both liberals and conservatives for wanting to control what happens on private property.
Liberals wanting to dictate hiring practices and who businesses have to serve.
And conservatives wanting to tell you what you can and can't do in your own home, like smoking, drinking, even your sexual habits.
It all comes back to the same thing. Should the government have the power to control these aspects of our lives?
So next up is democracy. The material takes a pretty critical look at it. Their main argument is that big, powerful governments are always a problem, no matter what form they take.
Whether it's a democracy, a monarchy, whatever, too much power in the hands of the government is never a good thing.
And they suggest that if the government stays relatively small and limited in what it can do, then it really doesn't matter so much what specific form it takes.
Right. It's the size and scope that matter most.
And they point out that the founders specifically chose to create a republic, not a pure democracy, because they were worried about the tyranny of the majority.
And they wanted to make sure the government followed strict rules, that it couldn't just do whatever it wanted.
They really criticized the modern welfare state, saying it's strayed too far from those original principles. And they argue that it's led to a loss of individual liberty, a decline in personal responsibility.
Like we've become too reliant on the government.
Exactly. They also point out that even a well-organized minority, especially if they're wealthy and influential, can manipulate the system to get what they want.
And they use the government to control people's lives, even when those people aren't hurting anyone else.
And they talk about the duty of elected officials to uphold their oath of office, even if it means going against what the majority might want.
Even if it's unpopular.
Yeah. Because they argue that a majority vote doesn't give you the right to violate someone else's fundamental rights. And they apply this same logic to the idea of using the military to force democracy on other countries.
Imposing your own values on others.
Now, on the topic of discrimination, they make a distinction between what they call positive discrimination and political or economic discrimination.
Positive discrimination is basically the right to choose who you associate with. Your friends, your partner, you get to decide.
And they say that's a fundamental freedom that the government shouldn't interfere with.
Right, it's your personal life.
But when it comes to the political and economic spheres, they're more cautious. They agree with the idea of banning discrimination within government programs.
That makes sense. The government should treat everyone equally.
But they're wary of laws that try to force integration and prevent discrimination in all private interactions, like affirmative action.
Because they argue that forcing people together doesn't actually solve the underlying problem. It can even make things worse.
They say that in a truly free society, people will naturally form groups and associations based on their own choices. And they argue that trying to outlaw all forms of discrimination has actually made society less free, less prosperous.
It's a really interesting perspective, and they raise the question of whether these laws have actually brought people closer together or pushed them further apart.
Now let's talk about education. The material is very critical of the public school system. They see it as a near monopoly that stifles competition and limits choices for parents and students.
Even with options like homeschooling and private schools, the regulations make it really hard to start new schools.
And they argue that things like vouchers and charter schools, while they might help a little, don't really address the core problem, which is government control.
The power of the state to dictate what kids are learning.
And then there's the whole issue of bias in textbooks. They say it's practically impossible to find a textbook, especially for social studies, that everyone can agree on.
Because those subjects are inherently subjective. It's like trying to find one religion that everyone will believe in.
Exactly. And they point out that in private schools and homeschooling, parents have much more control over what their kids are learning. They also criticize the push for national control over education, even though a lot of people, from parents to teachers, aren't happy with it.
Once the federal government gets involved, it's really hard to get them out.
Yeah. And they argue that more local control would lead to more diversity and less potential for propaganda.
More freedom to choose what and how your kids learn.
The material then uses this really powerful historical example to warn about the dangers of militarism. The story of Julius Caesar crossing the Rubicon River.
Which marked the end of the Roman Republic. It's a pretty dramatic illustration of how dangerous a powerful military can be to a free society.
But they make it clear that it wasn't just that one event. It was the slow buildup of military power outside of Rome that really set the stage for the Republic's collapse.
They're saying that a focus on military expansion can actually undermine the very ideals it's supposed to protect.
It's a cautionary tale for sure. And then they get into the whole topic of intelligence gathering and foreign policy. They really question whether all the money we're spending on intelligence is actually worth it.
They mentioned something like $80 billion a year, which is just mind-blowing.
And they raise concerns about whether Congress is really providing enough oversight of the CIA and other agencies.
Because if those agencies screw up, it often leads to the military getting involved, and then Congress feels pressured to support those actions no matter what.
They paint a pretty bleak picture of what happens when a country becomes too focused on interventionism, on building an empire. They even talk about how the idea of patriotism gets twisted to serve those goals.
It's like supporting the empire becomes the only way to be a true American.
And they use this example of President Bush mocking the fact that they didn't find any WMDs in Iraq.
It's like even when they're wrong, they don't want to admit it.
And they tie this to the idea that empires often lead to a decline in both liberty and economic stability. They say that when an empire seems wealthy, often through things like exploiting resources or manipulating currency, it creates this culture of dependence. People become less productive, more focused on getting their piece of the pie.
And they're willing to go into more and more debt to maintain that lifestyle. And they argue that it's a path that leads to the downfall of both the empire and the republic.
They also challenge the whole idea of this never-ending global war on terror, saying it's not a real war, at least not in the traditional sense. There's no clearly defined enemy, no declaration of war.
It's more like a perpetual state of fear that's being used to justify all sorts of actions that erode our freedoms.
They compare it to the war on poverty and the war on drugs. Just another way to scare people into giving up their liberty. And they even mention this idea of the noble lie, that some politicians believe they have the right to lie to the people for their own good.
That's a slippery slope.
And they criticize this tendency to blame everything on Muslim extremists, ignoring the role that our own foreign policy has played in creating those enemies.
It's called blowback. The CIA even had a term for it.
They argue that most terrorist acts are a response to some perceived injustice.
It doesn't excuse it, but it helps to understand where it's coming from.
They also talk about how presidential power has expanded when it comes to war, through signing statements, executive orders, and all that. They say that threats are often exaggerated to justify these actions.
Fear is a powerful motivator.
And they define true patriotism as being willing to question your government, to speak out against bad policies, not just blindly following along.
It's about standing up for what's right, even when it's hard.
They say that the goal should be to build a truly civilized society, one based on moral principles, not just to preserve the republic at all costs. And they warn that if we neglect those principles, if we just chase material wealth and security, we'll lose both prosperity and liberty.
It's a stark warning.
Okay, Moving on to religion and public life. The material criticizes the modern interpretation of the Constitution that tries to ban any public expression of faith. They call the people pushing this view evangelical atheists.
It's like they're trying to impose their own belief system on everyone else.
And they argue that local communities should be able to decide how they want to handle religious expression, not have it dictated by the Supreme Court or Congress. They also express concern about the push for national standards in education, seeing it as another way to control people's thoughts.
All about who has the power to decide.
The material also gets into how certain parts of the Constitution have been interpreted to greatly expand federal power. They specifically mention the Welfare Clause and the Interstate Commerce Clause.
They talk about cases like NLRB v. Jones and Laughlin and US v. Darby Lumber, which really broaden the scope of federal authority.
And they argue that the 10th Amendment, which was supposed to limit federal power, has basically been ignored. They also detail how presidential power has expanded in areas like war-making, trade policy, and emergency powers.
They talk about the War Powers Resolution, which was supposed to limit the president's ability to start wars, but has actually had the opposite effect.
And they mention things like fast-track trade agreements, the WTO, NAFTA, all these things that shift power away from Congress and toward the president. They even bring up the state secrets privilege, which allows the government to keep information hidden from the public.
Both Bush and Obama use that to their advantage.
And they talk about how the president has a lot of influence over spending and the Federal Reserve, even though that's not really spelled out in the Constitution. The sources then dive into the whole idea of fear and security. They argue that when we become too dependent on the government to keep us safe, it always comes at the cost of freedom.
And they accuse leaders of creating or exaggerating threats to justify wars and to benefit the military-industrial complex.
They criticize the way moral arguments are used to justify war, like saying it's just war or invoking figures like Gandhi or Martin Luther King.
They even call out the tactic of labeling anyone who disagrees as unpatriotic or un-American.
Now, they also have some pretty harsh words for what they call radical environmentalism. They portray some members of this movement as being against economic progress and even wanting to reduce the world's population.
They argue that this kind of thinking could lead to a lot of suffering if it was ever put into practice.
They also question the motives behind things like hate crime laws and the whole concept of political correctness.
They say that hate crime laws are often more about politics than justice, and they worry that political correctness could stifle free speech and even lead to a kind of thought police, especially in tough economic times.
On immigration, they believe that immigrants should be open to the principles of a free society. But they criticize the way some conservatives try to win over minorities with promises of government handouts.
It's like they're saying, vote for us and we'll give you stuff.
The material also defines true insurance as being based on risk that's accurately measured and priced in a competitive market. And they say that government programs like Social Security and Medicare aren't really insurance at all.
It's more like wealth redistribution, taking money from one group and giving it to another.
They argue that we should stop calling these programs insurance altogether because it's misleading.
It hides what they really are.
When it comes to economics, they're very critical of Keynesian policies and military spending. They argue that government borrowing and spending can't create real, lasting economic growth.
They call it military Keynesianism, and they say it just leads to waste and economic insecurity.
They argue that building up the military can actually make war more likely, and they criticize conservatives who support both small government and military spending.
They point out that military spending is a huge obstacle to actually cutting government spending overall.
On lobbying, they acknowledge that it's a protected right under the First Amendment, but they question the influence of all the money that special interests pour into trying to control the government.
They say that in Washington, politicians often end up serving the government itself rather than the people.
They describe the U.S. medical system as being a mess because of decades of government interference. And they use the example of government-provided car insurance to show why treating healthcare as a right is a bad idea.
They argue that government mandates on insurance companies lead to either bankruptcy or more government debt.
They also talk about how the shift to managed care has actually driven up costs and reduced the quality of care.
And they blame things like government mismanagement, restrictions by groups like the AMA, and inflation.
They say that the way we create money, by just printing more of it, is a big part of the problem.
Because it devalues the currency.
And they criticize medical licensing, saying it reduces competition and makes healthcare more expensive.
They say that more government involvement, especially if it's funded by debt, will just make things worse.
They really emphasize the dangers of a central bank, like the Federal Reserve, having too much power. And they argue that if we want to talk about liberty and limited government, we have to talk about the role of money in banking.
They advocate for a gold standard, a free market in banking, and competition among currencies.
They say the real problem with fixing the money system is political, not technical.
Because the government is addicted to paper money.
They're also critical of the nanny state mentality, where the government tries to protect us from ourselves.
And they warn about the dangers of central planning. When the government makes a mistake, it affects everyone.
They paint a pretty cynical picture of Washington, D.C., saying that there's a lack of morality and respect for the rule of law. They say this is true no matter which party is in power.
They argue that the government constantly expands its power, even if it means breaking its promises.
The sources also point out that even when the government is trying to help people, it often involves taking from some to give to others. And they argue that this is a form of theft, even if it's done through taxes.
They trace this back to a shift away from limited government towards a system where people expect the government to provide for them.
Now, they also touch on neoconservatism, mentioning people like Leo Strauss and some of the big names who shaped U.S. foreign policy.
They describe the neocon belief in the noble lie, the idea that it's okay to lie to the public if it's for their own good.
And they say neocons believe that we need an enemy to unite us and that individualism is bad.
They say neocons believe in a ruling elite, and they're willing to use things like religion and war to achieve their goals.
And they also talk about how neocons use patriotism as a way to silence dissent.
Anyone who disagrees is labeled un-American.
The material also references Samuel Johnson's famous quote about patriotism being the last refuge of a scoundrel. And they say that's what's happening in Washington today.
They're using patriotism to justify things that actually undermine liberty.
They define true patriotism as supporting the cause of liberty, even when it means challenging your own government. They talk about how power corrupts, even people who start out with good intentions. They also warn about the dangers of political correctness, saying it can be used to silence people and control what we're allowed to think.
They talk about attempts to ban books and songs just because someone finds them offensive.
And they worry that it could get much worse, especially if the economy goes south.
It's like when people are scared and desperate, they're willing to give up their freedom for security.
They use the example of prohibition to show what happens when the government tries to control people's personal choices, even if it's for their own good. They also talk about land ownership, arguing that in a free society, the people should own the land, not the government.
They point out how much land the federal government owns, especially in the West.
And they say that taxes and regulations basically make landowners renters anyway. They talk about the fight to limit the government's power of eminent domain.
They say the Fifth Amendment was meant to ensure fair compensation, not give the government a blank check to take whatever land they want.
The material defines racism as making assumptions about people based on their race, without even considering their individual qualities.
They give the example of dismissing a black economist just because they don't agree with the NAACP.
They also criticize the way religion is used to justify war, arguing that most wars aren't really about religion at all.
It's more about power and politics.
And they say that bad foreign policy is often more to blame for conflict than religious extremism.
They also talk about the Patriot Act, saying it basically shreds the Fourth Amendment's protection against unreasonable searches. They say it gives the government the power to spy on anyone without any real justification.
They use the example of slavery to show how important issues can be swept under the rug. But they argue that those issues always come back to haunt us.
And they say that slavery isn't just about owning people. It's about any form of government control that denies individuals their basic freedoms.
They suggest that even though the Constitution isn't perfect, it could have worked if people had been more committed to its principles.
But they argue that even the best laws can't protect liberty if people don't value it.
They also bring up the issue of tariffs, using examples from history to show how they can hurt trade and lead to conflict.
Protectionism always backfires in the long run.
They talk about the importance of trial by jury, and specifically the idea of jury nullification.
That's the power of a jury to refuse to convict someone even if they technically broke the law.
And they point out that this power has been weakened because juries aren't always told about it.
They're kept in the dark.
They warn that the biggest threat to liberty will come from the government itself, as it tries to hold on to its power and control.
They even suggest that the government will cut back on things like welfare before it gives up its control over the military and police.
They interpret the anger of the Tea Party as a sign of how bad things have gotten.
It's a sign that people are fed up with the government's overreach.
They argue that you can't support big government and individual liberty at the same time.
It's a contradiction.
And they say the same thing about people who want to expand the welfare state and have a balanced budget, or those who advocate for military intervention and personal freedom. They say all that government spending leads to debt and inflation, which ultimately hurt everyone.
And they argue that trying to create a civilized society through taxation is a bad deal for liberty.